So, today I am here with Mike Barbeau, the now line developer for Savage Worlds Pathfinder. The Pathfinder for Savage Worlds. I don't know why I said it backwards. And we are going to be talking about the 1.3 release of the core rules, the Bestiary, what do we else read? Books 2 and 3 of Rise of the Rune
Yep.
Lords. I think that's it. I think that's we also have just generally out Hall's Last Hope and book 1 of Rise of the Rune Lords.
Correct.
But there's not any new, data to talk about with that. So as always, folks, if you have questions, things you want to talk about, go ahead and drop it into the chat. Otherwise, Mike, what do you think? Do you have any changes in this 1.3 that you want to highlight?
I think the biggest one to talk about is limited free actions, right?
Yes.
These are something that we didn't publish until the most recent edition, but they're something that to an extent has always existed. There have always been the once per round effects going on. There's a lot of creatures that had like the ability to only do something once per round. What we did is when we were looking at these, especially when we got to high levels, legendary 3+, we were talking about the Karzog fights before this. You would end up building characters that had 9 of these once per turn actions, and so in the grand scheme of things, it still didn't feel like they were that special. And we started going across all of them and looking at these things here and saying, all right, well, what feels like it should be a bit more complicated, more restrictive? What can help add a bit of balance as we do these things? And I think a great example was Chris. Chris had just mixed, what was it, Monk, Fighter, and 1 or 2 others by Legendary. Yeah, mind you all, we were, they were the characters were 18 advances in, right? So it's not like this is something that came up 2 advances into it. But it made the turns kind of go a bit longer, and rather than giving people options that they wanted to pick per round, it was, we've jokingly said this about other things. Round 1, you go Super Saiyan, everything drops, and then your other rounds are just kind of, doing whatever else you had left that you didn't do that time. And by adding the limited action, the full encompassing effect that we've done here, it gives people a lot more choice. The play style from round to round differs. Some enemies, such as the Shining Child, don't just double down on the same 2 abilities every single round. And so it helped keep everything fast, and it helped not only keep abilities, powers, things like that in line, but make them feel unique and exciting. And so this is something we've got now, as you all will have seen in the 1.3 or 1.3?
Yeah, 1.3.
1.3 update, yeah.
If you look at StreamYard, we've got the text below that I should have just read when I was doing the intro, but for some reason didn't look at. That was a fairly substantive change. But again, it's not anything that is, as you said, it's just codifying things that we were basically all doing. I think something that is perhaps going to be a little more sexy to talk about is the changes to the monk.
Yes.
And kind of the process that we went through to get there. So we were still kind of internally not super happy with where the monk was sitting. The monk had a bunch of cool things. I don't think the change that we had right before this final one ever saw the light of day for the general tester or the general community. But we were trying out things like Mike had proposed, because so much of the monk's coolness was predicated on getting a raise, right? And we're talking primarily about the core monk class edge, not the more advanced stuff, because a lot of that leverages mystic powers, which once you've got those mystic powers, you're feeling pretty cool. But at a low level and kind of at a core, the monk still felt like it was kind of lacking, right? So we had done things like bump up the running die so that you've got a D8 running die as opposed to a D6. And that paired with the +1 that you got to toughness, the +1 to hit, I think it is, and the D10 bonus damage just meant that when you are a monk and your class is monk, you are just better in basically every way physically to any other fighter, right? You get that one step up, which definitely fits into the fantasy of the monk.
Yeah, no, I was it's very much what we went for, right? If you were to strip all the gear off all of the heroes and look at all the different class edges, the edge that gives you the most for being the pinnacle of physical perfection is the monk. And like you said, we had a couple versions, right? We've sat with the monk. I know a lot of people have looked over and commented on the monk over time. We've done the same thing. And especially, not just early on in a monk, because a monk could keep up really well early. When it started having trouble feeling like it wasn't shining as well, came, I think, closer to heroic. When things had more like innate, like armor piercing and stuff like that for running against tougher enemies. And so unarmed strike overall, like getting the +1 fighting, getting the AP2, just brings them up more in line with what you expect and be able to dish out some damage like all the other heroes as well.
Yeah, so like one of the things that I think this was your suggestion, right? Because before 1.3, the monk would have that bonus damage, right? So they'd have a D10 bonus damage, which you're only getting if you get a raise, and then their stunning fist ability, right? Which is I am either going to make you distracted or vulnerable if I get a raise. And so now everything that is cool for a monk happens on a raise, right? All the other things they're there, but they're not active abilities that you use. So I think one of the iterations was allowing the monk player, instead of just always wanting to chase the raise on their hit, say, okay, well, if you hit but you don't get a raise, then you get to choose to either do the effect or the damage. So instead of damaging the opponent, you could make them vulnerable, you could make them distracted, right? And that might be useful in different situations. If you make them vulnerable, then basically you're offsetting the multi-action penalty for your second hit and also getting a little bit of extra damage, which might be useful. But that was kind of it was a little clunky, and now all of a sudden you had to kind of really think of, okay, what am I going to do now that I've hit, right? Most of the decision making in combat is before you roll your attack. It's okay, where am I going to position myself? What ability am I going to use? What weapon am I going to use? Which target am I going to attack? Once you've done those things, we kind of want the process to be fairly locked in and straightforward, right? Because at that point, it's the opponent, the person who's being hit, that's making a decision. Do I soak? Do I, whatever? Do I spend a penny to re-roll my soak? How much do I need to avoid these wounds? It's their reaction is after you've hit. And so the reason we wanted that was because, as Mike was saying, once you got to the higher levels, the monk just wasn't dealing enough damage to be as competitive when they didn't get a raise. But we want them to be able to do stuff when they don't get a raise. And we just kept kind of looking at the different axes we had, because really the problem we were trying to solve is when the monk gets a D8 damage, they've spent three edges to get there, right? They've got their core monk ability, and then they've probably got brawler and bruiser. I might have said those in the wrong order. And now you've got a D8 damage plus your strength plus your bonus damage. All a fighter had to do to get that damage was pick up a longsword. And the fighter can enchant that longsword, and the longsword comes with AP, and if it's master, we can get some extra AP, and then there's other things you can do to even give it more AP and more damage. So the monk doesn't have the same opportunities to use magic items that the other classes do, and they don't have those same opportunities to get more armor piercing. And that's kind of, we were trying to figure out how can we do something special or more bespoke for the monk to make it work. Then Shane said, well, let's just give him AP2 and call it done. That's the problem. Let's just solve that. Just give it AP2 when you're fighting unarmed. Good to go.
Yeah, there was a lot of looking at, like, well, can we make it harder for enemies to soak, or can they always do something like this? And it always came back to the point where monks were having a hard time later on getting that wound. And I think more importantly than that, as you said, like, you felt bad when you didn't get a raise, right? Rather than feeling cool when you got a raise and doing extra, you felt like you were cheating yourself. And so, players would throw everybody they had trying to get that first raise on an attack, or do nothing. And so now I think we've got them in a good place where, after all the work we've done on them, the monk hits, pun intended, hits really well with where we wanted him to be. Um, so yeah, I think the monk was a great change on that.
Something that I think will help that we updated in 1.3, and this is kind of, well, actually, as this and another thing are kind of the two, I think, most like widespread macro changes. But magic items should be a little easier for folks to read now. We realized that we were using the kind of basically the same language to describe two different things. So we ended up swapping the, I can't even
Price
remember
and
what
cost naming.
yeah, it used to be cost, and now it's price.
Right.
Is selling in a shop. And then the other thing is the mystic powers. So we also learned in the middle, or not the middle. Yeah, no, it was the middle of the first Karzog fight that we were doing, playtesting it. Because I had mystic powers because I was a paladin, paladin fighter, arcane archer. I think I was. I think the change that we made to mystic powers, where it used to be, it was 1 power point to use the power, 2 power points to use it with a raise. And that was back when you had like 5 power points and that was it, and we were doing all the other things. And I don't know how we've gone, what based on what you folks were talking about, months with this rule being different and me not knowing. In part because I was never playing somebody who had mystic powers. I've been playtesting the bard and the druid and the cleric. But so I discovered in what was the second to last playtest session we did that mystic powers did not work the way I thought it did, and that you did the base cost of the power, and then we were changing it from its 1 extra point for the raise effect to 2 points.
Yeah.
And I think we traced it down, and that was the week where I'd had my wisdom teeth removed.
Yes.
And
yeah.
so I wasn't in a state to recognize the subtle changes we were making to different abilities.
Yes, that's absolutely what happened. And to speak on mystic powers a bit more, because mystic powers is another one of those things that I think people have talked a lot, and I very reasonably been questioning like where it sits in strength, because it does let a power go off automatically, right? And we've spent a lot of time trying to make sure that with checks and balances, that it feels like a different kind of spell casting, and B, that it sits right and functions. And so earlier it was never a case where you wouldn't pay that extra PowerPoint for a raise, right? It was always going to happen because it was just well worth it. Now upping it by an additional 1 to get 2, it seems like it's such a small amount, right? To say we went from 1 to 2, it's not that big of a bump. But as we sat down and started looking at how combats were functioning, at what powers you were using per round, we started looking at, okay, well, you can't now do a raise on all your abilities and make sure you heal at the end. You can't do this and that. And so it started running into situations where, like, the paladin was choosing, did he want to raise on his boost trait? How hurt was his ally? And you can always, of course, spend a penny for more power points, but depending on what's going on, where you're at, you may not have any. And I know Simon a couple times has had to make that hard choice on what he wanted to do. There's also, of course, talk on the Shadow Dancer, which famously, infamously, has like the only attack power in Mystic Powers. It used to have 2.
Yep.
One thing we did was we made sure all the mystic powers were in line, right? So Shadow Dancer used to have more than everybody else, but it's kind of like if you're looking at an arcane background with 15 power points and 2 powers, arcane background with 10 power points and 3 powers, right? Suddenly throwing an extra power in either of those makes it seem weird because it doesn't follow the obvious flow. So we brought it down, and bolts and blast. We were looking at those, and Bolt was the most easily abused. It's cheaper, right? It's easier to do. It's got more stuff that it needs to ignore if you're just having it go off automatically. And I'm not saying Blast is weak by any stretch of the imagination. Blast is awesome. I think it's 7 or 8 points if you want.
Continue without me.
Okay, it's like 7 or 8 points if you want to do a big blast. And that's great. If you've got people huddled together, you'll be able to do some cool damage, take something out. If you've got something that's resistant to anything except magic or magic damage, it'll help with that. But in the end, at least personally, I think some of their other abilities, like a Shadow Dancer's ability to dash in, take some swings, and then teleport out to safety with their mystic powers, creates a far more dynamic and interesting character. Plus, it's just so expensive to do all the blasts that you're not going to do it, multiple times every fight, stuff like that. So there's been a lot of playing around with it. The Shadow Dancer has gone from its invincible, version forever ago to I think more of a hit and run supportability type edge that allows a player to do extra stuff. Apparently, you were shaken, Don.
Yeah. No, I think famously I broke the Shadow Dancer originally. I don't know if we ever told that story, but I got to the point where I was a monk. I was a and a draconic bloodline sorcerer, so I got the maximum you could get for unarmored damage with AP. And I took light darkness as one of my powers, so that way I could just generate the darkness I needed for Shadow Dancer. And that was back when being in the illumination penalty was half of that was a bonus to your toughness as a Shadow Dancer. And so I also had, by virtue of the monk I made, basically the highest toughness you could get without armor, and then added on top. So in this fight where we've swum under a wall and popped up, and there's a bunch of ogres wailing on us, everybody else is getting the crap kicked out of them by these ogres. And I'm just standing there in the pitch darkness. Of course, the ogres have infrared vision, so they ignore the penalties. But they're just wailing on me and cannot do enough damage to actually get through. That's when we realized there's a problem here.
This is relatively early on too. Like it was basically, I think, the first veteran that you're able to get it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that went some big changes. I think the other big thing that came out was, of course, the Bestiary, right?
Yes.
That finally got released, which I was super excited to see get out because that had a lot of time put into it. There's so many creatures that we tried to pull over and make feel unique, yet also feel the way they should for playing them in Pathfinder. One thing to point out that I think some people will notice, some might miss, is like we did in Rise of the Rune Lords, a lot of the creatures, well, if they have a specific ancestry, like say giant, it will have a line for giant. And what we've done in order to avoid massive amounts of bullets per creature, just because creatures in Pathfinder innately kind of have more abilities that we had to convert, because there's just more supernatural, more magic, more everything, which is awesome because it creates cool creatures. But we wanted to try to condense it as much as possible. And so when you run into like a giant entry, it'll have giant or ancestry giant, and it'll mention its like size. If it has something like SWAT, it'll mention that. Anything that's really particular to that. And similarly, on top of Undead, right, which everybody's used to Undead at this point, you have the Undead bullet.
Yep.
We added, I believe it was Archons, demons, devils, dragons, right? These things that have this
Yep.
wide grouping. And so, one on the forums, just to point out, for example, is the dragon doesn't have SWAT listed under its bullet points because dragons themselves all have SWAT. So the terminology for it, ignoring up to 4 points of size penalty, that's listed within that entry. So it'll be one thing to keep an eye on as you're looking through this, and trying to spot like what creatures have what benefits. Vampires, have their own different sidebar for their weaknesses now because, I mean, the ancient vampire in the Swade core book alone, right? That had a lot, and so a Pathfinder vampire, you basically start off with an ancient vampire, and then apply it to whatever template you see fit. Which some people might see something of that when Book 6 for Rise of the Runelord gets released. Spoiler alert. So yeah, the Bestiary was a huge thing that went out.
So this is a question I have because I'm scrolling through it trying to find it, but I don't know if it actually survived contact with the enemy. Remember early on we had talked about how we were thinking of doing basically having those step stages of, okay, so here's your goblin, here's your slightly worse goblin, here's your worst goblin.
Yeah, we've got some of those. So as most you'll notice, there's an entry early on in which we talk about. Oh, wow! Look at that. Can I pretend that was all me that did that? I said the words and it just happens. Uh, so I got distracted now. What I was talking about, that was a great way to distract me. Yes, it was All Might on Magic. And I did jazz hands. Sorry. So that's what I was talking about. There's an entry where we talk about tougher enemies, right? Because there are like goblins, there's ogres, we even did this with trolls, in which you have the full profile of it. And then as you progress through, I think, for example, we have feral or savage trolls as like the next rank up, and it adds on additional things. So as your parties are going through and they're fighting things that they've fought before, you have two options, right? You can run the standard monsters that they fought in the past that they now can probably walk through a bit easier, right? With their heads held high. Or on top of that, you can throw in some more veteran type leaders. I think kobolds, for example, the veteran version, if you want to call it that, gains an arcane background because it's a shaman. And so it gives you also the ability to just sit on one page, look at the kobolds and be like, all right, here's the kobolds, here's the kobold, fighters, and then here's the kobold shamans. And you've got all the rules there for you to run an encounter.
So Mike, you keep running through and using these different examples, and I keep trying to scroll to that example so I can read a little bit of the text out to the audience, and you keep changing examples. So we're not gonna go do the kobolds because I've just scrolled all the way down to T to troll to use that as an example. But so for example, right, your default troll, it has a D8 in agility, D4 in smarts and spirit, strength of D12, vigor of D12, and then it's at and this is just the default troll entry, and its fighting is D8, right? And so that gives it a toughness of 11, one with armor, and a parry of 6. Then you go down to the feral troll, which is in red text at the bottom, and its vigor gets bumped up to a D12 plus 2, so now its toughness is a 12, 1. Its fighting goes up to 10, so now its parry is 7, and now it's also got first strike. And then you go up one step further to the troll brute, which now has a strength of D10, or sorry, it's not necessarily one step further, but it's a different one. The strength D10 for the troll brute, but its fighting is D12, right? So it's going to be doing less damage than the troll, but it's going to be hitting a lot more, and it also gets counterattack.
One thing to bring up here, and anybody who has read anything in book 3, I believe it is, for Eyes, or has read The Troll, you'll notice Rending Attack. That is the horrible thing I introduced,
Yes.
that I love. As a hint to players, when your GM asks you, do you want to be shaken? Do you want to soak that? What do you want to do? consider the creature coming at you. You might end up getting shaken and bleeding profusely. And Simon will attest that that can be the downfall of any person who
Yes.
underestimated a creature like a troll.
Yeah, so I'm not going to give away the full store for free, but so if you're hit with a rending attack, if you're even if you're just shaken, now you have to start making vigor checks. Otherwise, you're going to be taking wounds every round from your bleeding. And let me tell you, the fights against trolls and ogres with their damn ogre hooks went from being like, okay, yeah, sometimes Mike rolls a 44 for damage and one shot somebody, but besides that, we're not having to worry too much about them. They're occasionally plinking and plonking, giving us a wound here or there, but we can generally heal it up. To, okay, don't get wounded anymore because I'm not going to heal you for 2 wounds on my turn because you took the wound and then you started bleeding out.
Yeah, my favorite was you guys were doing this big fight, and there was like multiple rooms that you go through, and Simon goes in. He gets hit, right? Because he's all about not getting hit with his paladin, and he gets carved into by this troll, gets shaken, and I try to be like, do you want to soak it? What do you want to do? He's like, nope, I'm taking it. It's all right. You're bleeding. He's stunned the rending attack. And then he's like, oh, well, I'll get away so I don't get damaged. And so he starts running deeper into the buildings, away from the healer.
Yep.
And, no matter how high, you eventually roll bad on your vigor roll. And so he's just like slowly bleeding to death because he didn't like have any potions on him. I don't think he
Yep.
had mystic powers at the time, or at least he didn't have any more power points. And so he's
I think this was back when PowerPoints were very scarce, and so he couldn't spend a penny to get more PowerPoints.
Yeah, no. So it's interesting because you'll run into some creatures here, and they can hit you and be terrifying, but a lot of them will have abilities, right? That can do
Yep.
other things that'll either debilitate you or transform you or continually harm you throughout it. So there's a wide breadth of creatures, and of course, if you're like me, you grab any Suede book so that you can use the monsters in other Suede settings. So hopefully, anybody
Well,
who
yeah,
does that, can find joy.
kind of like John Doom said. He said reading the Bestiary made me feel like 13 and coming up with all sorts of cool ideas. It's only slightly not 100% portable as a standalone book because you do need some stuff from the core Savage Pathfinder rules. But otherwise, even if you don't think you're going to ever want to run a Pathfinder game set in Galarian, like we added a lot of creatures that are either A, did not exist in Suede, or B, variants on what you had in Suede for fantasy. And I think especially you know, when Shane finishes up the Fantasy Companion and that's coming out, I think you're going to see a lot of people use the Fantasy Companion and the Savage Pathfinder Bestiary, just because we're not going to do, I don't, well, at moment, maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't think there's any plans to do like a third Bestiary that's just the Fantasy Companion Bestiary. I'm sure we'll have creatures in there, but it's not going to be a book that is just a book of monsters, unlike the Savage Pathfinder version.
Yeah, and
Just because there's so many monsters that we need to be able to fulfill that it's basically its own book worth.
yeah, yeah, and we continue to as we work through this, look to the future of what we want to see and what expands. Um, you know, we're focusing on getting everything out to everybody and making the product as good as we can. And of course, we're looking forward to what are the next edges people want to see. What are the next types of creatures we can include. I know we didn't have any dinosaurs in the initial bestiary, but I promise you, with 7 bestiaries, I think that Paizo has put out, in the future, there's plenty of room for us to add all of these creatures so that if you want to run a fantasy game or, any monster hunter style game where you decide that, we're going after demons and only demons, the dream is one day you can just open these books and grab the variations you want and come up with crazy ideas and epic stories.
So I've got a question for chat. I think it would be a fairly interesting example. Well, it depends if chat chooses a good creature to go through. But I think it'd be a fairly interesting thing for us to do on Design Corner to pick one of the creatures from the bestiary and go through kind of what was the process of building that, because since I have Mike here who worked on all these monsters, we can talk about that versus me who has not worked at all in the bestiary and is thankful for that, because I've had enough other work to do. So I think first come first serve, somebody throw out a Pathfinder monster that you want us to go through. And okay, George Orr already won it with the Drider. So let me go ahead and you know what? There's not actually no. Sorry, with the overlay, there's not a good way for me to share my let's try it. Let's see if I can get this working.
See if you can pull it off.
Yeah, so it should. Oh, hold up. Let me put this on my second monitor. So that way, if it'll go over there. All right. And
So
share that.
Just for the last one that was mentioned.
Okay. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, we turned the overlay off. I don't have an overlay prepped for we're gonna have 2 people on the side and content.
Yeah. No, the last comment about the Spotless Dragon, this was a little bit earlier, but we've covered a lot of stuff. SWAT is covered under the dragon bullet point. Rather than calling out SWAT, it's just all dragons. Ignore 4 points of size penalty.
Okay, so for folks that are not able to read the share screen or just listen to the audio, we've got the Drider up here. Driders are created from the body of a drow, warped and mutated through special poisons and elixirs to take on the characteristics of a giant spider. A female Drider's lower spider body is sleek and graceful like a Black Widow's body, while its torso and beautiful face retain characteristics of the drow with the addition of sharp, poisonous fangs. A male Drider's lower body is bulky like a tarantula, while its upper body is wiry and its hideous face more spider than drow, complete with fanged mandibles. It is a evil aberration Drider. So I literally asked this question earlier today. So Mike, why did we say the name of the creature next to its type everywhere?
Yeah, so this is something that comes with us wanting to stay uniform. Anybody who reads Rise of the Runelords, there's a lot of characters, a lot of wild cards and named creatures in there. And I won't go calling them out individually, but the hardest thing for a new reader or a new GM was to have to read through all the bullets and then find where it comments on, what this named creature was, whether it was a lich or a particular type of demon, or what have you. And so to make that obvious, we were looking at the types because we also, with the Ranger, and I think a couple other things took advantage of utilizing types. So we had that there. And it became easy just to put in parentheses what it was. In addition, there are throughout all of Pathfinder a lot of variants. So there might be, for example, a particular type of nymph that is specific to ice regions, and she has a different name, but she is still a nymph. With the core bestiary, all of the creatures you're looking at are their name. I think the one example that needs tweaked is the Drow Noble. It should just be Drow. But it's because we wanted to make sure that you didn't look at Rise of the Runelords and go, why is it here and not in every other book? And so we added it here. That way there's no confusion. It's a little bit redundant in the bestiary, but I think it's nicer to have for you to be used to than to get confused or caught off guard when you bust out a module and try to run it and just can't understand something.
Yeah, also depending on art and the amount of flavor text that's there, sometimes you can kind of get fairly far from the title to actually reading the stat block. So having that reminder there's not the worst thing. But so I'm not going to read out all of their abilities, but just for the sake of argument, because this is literally the place where Mike and Chris Warner started. So here's I gotta scroll on this page, not on StreamYard. Here is what a Drider looks like in 5th edition, or not 5th edition, in Pathfinder. So you've got it's a chaotic evil large aberration, CR7, right? And just kind of a quick snapshot. This is not necessarily the most audio friendly portion, but we're getting pretty far into the weeds. But you can also yourselves at home pull up the Drider on d20pfsrd.com, the official resource there, and look through all of its different things. So this is kind of the place where you start when you're converting basically anything is what does the source text say? So how do we get from here, Mike, to here?
So the first thing that I look at, and I say this a lot, is kind of what's the purpose of the Drider. Driders, while they can do physical stuff and they do have their heavy maces and stuff, the thing that I think is very imposing with the Drider is its ability to mix that and its poison with the arcane might that it can weave. As you saw before, it had the ability to become invisible. It had the ability to buff itself, to debuff enemies, and worse, to throw lightning, right? So you can walk into a room and all of a sudden, or a hallway, and all of a sudden, 2 arcs of lightning come at you from somewhere as these Driders are ambushing you, right? And so I wanted to make sure that a big part of that was brought in. And so when you look at the core bestiary, the Drider itself, of course, it has the arcane background, which it needs to be able to do its business, and it's got the dodge, right, to help represent how it stays back and it uses its arcane might. The bolt dispel, and let's take a second here to talk about dispel. One thing I'm sure everybody noticed long ago is dispel is a novice power.
Yep.
I am not saying that you cannot play Savage Pathfinder without dispel. However, Golarion is a very magical world, right? From novice all the way to legendary plus. There's a lot of magic, a lot of abilities going on, and so you'll see dispel being a lot more common. Not in such a way that spellcasters can't deal with enemies and that it won't work, but in such a way that both players and enemies have ways to deal with some incoming spellcasting issues. So that made up the majority of its powers. We wanted to keep its ability to bite creatures and its ability to distribute poison proper. And then with innate powers, we wanted to mimic the things that it can do constantly, right? So when you look at a Drider, it can do like lightning bolt 4 times a day. Yeah, it can do visibility so many times per day, but it does have at will stuff, right? These are things that it can just do over and over. Some of them are at will, some are constant, or dancing lights, darkness, fairy fire, that kind of thing. That's where Chris and I went in and used innate powers to mimic them, right? Because it does not require power points to do that. You spend the action and you do the minor or major version as needed. And so the combination of doing that and using its actual arcane background allows it to pull off a lot of the magic. Another thing you'll notice is we gave it immunity slumber. It has in the Pathfinder core, it's sleep that it's immune to. We've made it slumber. It's essentially the same thing. And you'll notice that with a lot of creatures as well, where we tried to check the immunities. When you look at oozes, you'll see similar things where we said, what is it immune to? What do we need to include here? To make sure it still felt the same way. And so when you're going at them with whatever combat style you have, you're going to have to pay attention to this, right? Your GM's going to be able to look down and identify what will and won't work. We're talking about Driders here as a side note. Golems are particularly nasty against spellcasters, right? And they require a completely different approach.
And that's a very good point to bring up and talk about a little bit is, so this isn't exactly the methodology, or this isn't exactly the thought process behind it, but it's something that's a useful lighthouse for us to have is you should be able to come over to Savage Pathfinder and largely your tactics for, okay, this is how you deal with this kind of monster in regular Pathfinder should work and be applicable, and that knowledge should translate into Savage Pathfinder, right? So this instance, like the Drider is immune to sleep, so you can't use slumber on it, right? Because that is an element of the creature. It's again, we constantly spend a lot of time in this weird space where the mechanics are the setting and the setting is the mechanics, and so because these things end up so intertwined, having something like, okay, you just can't use slumber on the Drider means you don't have a point where somebody could come in who's an experienced Pathfinder player, be playing Savage Pathfinder, and then be like, wait a minute, you can slumber the Drider? That doesn't make any sense. You can't do that in Pathfinder. And while that's not the only consideration, that is a very useful thing for us to constantly pull back to, because if somebody was writing, I don't know if there is a narrative anywhere that exists in Pathfinder where you have a narrative text that talks about somebody trying to sleep a Drider and it doesn't work. But if you had that happen, right, in an official piece of fiction, that I don't need to say it. It's not appropriate for this moment. See, I know what ludonarrative means, and so I'm using it appropriately. Landauer in the back doesn't, so that's why he's trying to egg me on. But the fiction of the world is so often its mechanics that we have to kind of constantly pull back to that and make sure we're keeping that in mind.
Yeah, one thing we did try to avoid here is there are certain abilities that are just too finicky, and Drider doesn't have as many, but like bleed, for example, in Pathfinder, it's if you're stabilized below 0 and something casts bleed, you just start bleeding out again. If you're incapacitated, you're in a bad way. We don't need an ability to say, hey, by the way, you're still really dying, surprise. And so we tried to avoid some of these that were either finicky or if we could wrap them into other abilities themselves. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of the stuff comes, where we start trying to see, what's the fat we can trim, because each of these, creatures, you look at the Drider here itself, it's got a lot of bullets, right? We won't try to hide that. It is what it is, but it's converting a lot and it's covering a lot. Some of it is look and forget, like armor, ancestry,
Right.
size. That's all kind of calculated unless you're, a gnome with giant killer.
But we want to make sure that you see the math, right? It's not valuable for us to just come down from the tower and say Driders have a 11 toughness. You want to know how they got that 11 toughness. Which
especially when they have what was that?
I think it's supposed to be 10. I don't think we took into account slender. I think that was one of the points of feedback I put in the spreadsheet.
There we go.
I think it was literally the Drider I was doing the math on, trying to figure out what its toughness should be.
Yeah, and that happens, right? Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many times we've gone over each creature, and while we don't use CR, right? It's not like you're going to go through the book and find your CR7 or your CR6. The one thing that really does help us do is we look at how far into a campaign or an adventure you tend to run into this creature. Yes. And so when we're wavering, this is when you get into the art aspect. If we're wavering on where to land that stat, we're looking at where heroes tend to be, where things tend to be at that point, and that helps us lean in that direction. There's other things that come into play, like size. You'll notice as you look at a lot of bigger creatures, they all have higher strengths, with an Aboleth's an exception, but that's because you look at the type of creature it is and what its strength represents rather than just its size.
Yeah, there's also some of the feedback that folks were dropping in is, well, isn't this creature technically a size 3, right? And it would be like, this creature is a couple 100 pounds heavier than what size 2 lists, but it's not as heavy as what we list in size 3. And that's kind of where you have to make that call of like, well, because it's not a 1-to-1, you have to think, is that extra point of toughness or the other benefits that it gets, the new strength band that it should be represented in, is that appropriate for the creature? And that's where you kind of have to make those judgment calls. George Orr asks, does Pathfinder... I'm sharing the screen. I'm trying to click his thing.
Let me answer in just a second. I want to share an interesting thing, and then I will get into it. So here it's easy. Size 2, Driders are the size of a horse. That is no problem. That's a very easy translation. For those of you who want to look at the elementals, I think in Pathfinder, an air or fire elemental weighs like 2 pounds, but it is a massive creature, right? And so that's when we have to look at, okay, well, what is the intent? What do we want the size representing? Especially when we look at like how tough we want something to be, like how hard should a Drider be to kill? We have the conversion of its natural armor, we have the conversion of its size, we have the conversion of its constitution or its vigor in this case. And so then we have to look and say, well, on top of all this, we don't just want to max everything out and make it unkillable. We want to look at how tough it needs to be. Which, if you want to reread his question, I'll now jump into that aspect of it.
Yeah. So George Orr asked, "Does Pathfinder use we should clarify his question. Does Savage Pathfinder use CR? And if so, did you use that information in creating critters for Suede?"
Right. And so this is where we don't use CR. You're not going to look in here and find CR. So you're not going to look at the Drider and see CR7. Did we use it? Absolutely. And this is where some of that other stuff came in, where we would look at it and say, okay, how much gold do you have to buy gear? How many advances do you have? Where is the average character at? Whether you're a spellcaster, whether you're a melee fighter, archer, whatever, we wanted to see where it was at. And we looked at where it was at in Pathfinder, right? And so then we could start comparing, all right, well, this is where its size landed. We're subtracting this from its armor, right? So it's weaker there. That way we can bump its vigor. Or in cases where a creature was meant to be able to resist powers or abilities from high level characters, we go, okay, what do we need its stat to be at for something like this? And so you might see, if you were to look and convert every single creature in Pathfinder, you might see one that has the same stats, like strength, dex, con, all that stuff, as one that's a much higher CR. But when you look in here, you see we may have bumped some up slightly higher or reduced another or added an ability just to make sure it could properly adjust for the level of difficulty. And that's also where the creatures we talked about earlier, that bump to a troll, came in, where we would look and go, okay, trolls are, encountered, I think, at CR5 usually, right? So we made sure the troll was properly built for that. But what happens when you go in as a veteran level character and you raid, this massive troll den and you want to give your players a fight? You don't want to just have to make up everything about the troll being tougher off the cuff. So you want to be able to be presented with something that's tougher, a higher CR, or just in general a scarier fight, right? And so that's how we used the CR to add in with all of the other stuff we did here to give the hopefully proper level of difficulty to each of these creatures.
Yeah. Well, and that's also one of the things that, like even if you're just playing original Pathfinder, it's something that is not a consistent thing, right? You don't only encounter goblins at 3rd level and then past that you never encounter goblins again, right? There are instances where you'll have goblins that challenge, 7, 8, 9th level characters, in addition to having different versions of goblins that challenge 3rd level characters. And so the fact that basically GMs can throw any of these creatures at their players at any point, you just, you make the adjustments to make it a good fight. Having those extra versions in there allows us to, like Mike said, do a bunch of that work for the GM and make sure that you can have your low-level trolls, your high-level trolls, your mid-level trolls, and not have to do as much design work on your end. Because something that can be very tricky as a GM is, the first time you deploy these creatures is potentially the only time you're ever going to use them. And so having to go in with an untested design in the encounter you need it for can often be a risky thing. So us taking some of that off your shoulders and giving you options that are kind of baked in for those different difficulty levels should help GMs a lot.
Yeah, there's another one that tends to fluctuate is spell resistance. So Drider has SR18. For those of you who don't know Pathfinder, it's a check you have to get past for your spell to properly go off on the creature. It's to an extent, it's arcane resistance, right? Now there's various levels of arcane resistance, from the kind where you kind of need a 1 to fail, to get past it, to, depending on what level you are, needing high numbers. And so each creature that did have spell resistance, whether it was the aberrations like the Drider or demons, CR and its other abilities are again where we looked and said, okay, uh, do we want arcane resistance on this? And there also came a point where we had to look at it and say, how many have arcane resistance? We don't want everything to have it because it is a lot stronger of an ability in Savage Worlds than spell resistance is in Pathfinder, right? And so we wanted to look at what should have these penalties. If it has SR 10, and it's a creature that you normally fight after, 6 advances, that's not something we care about, right? Because it's not something a Pathfinder character would be struggling as much with. So we don't want, players to be struggling as much with it as well. And it'll also tend to combine with other things we have favored powers, right? And if you have favored powers bolt or an offensive ability, and the creature will often be invisible and has arcane resistance and whatever other abilities that might come up, we want to make sure that we're not taking something that in Pathfinder might fail 1 in 20 times to something you're going to fail 1 in 5, right? Because that's not the feeling that you want to get from it. And so that's why as you look through, again, you'll see no SR or arcane resistance on this creature, but you'll see it on a lot of demons who have a similar spell resistance. If you care to go through and look at their Pathfinder.
Also, don't forget, folks, that we have other levers that we can pull for basically the same thing, right? By bumping something spirit up, often that's functionally getting you to the same place of that creature is not going to be affected by the powers often. And the other thing that I think is actually it helps us, right? It's the burden that we don't have that the designers for original Pathfinder did have is we don't say this is an appropriate level for a 7th level character or an appropriate challenge for a 7th level character. So there's nothing that says we need to make sure that a Drider is going to wipe a novice character, right? When you encounter something like those SRs that are for the appropriate level of character, trivially easy for them to overcome, often that's to bake in that, the first level characters should be absolutely, or this first level spellcaster should be absolutely terrified of the Drider because it is they're not going to be able to get a single spell off. Because we don't have that same locking out lower level play versus higher CR creatures, we can be a little more judicious in when do we actually give them those abilities, right? You don't want everything to have arcane resistance in the game just because everything at SR, because then it's no longer fun for the spellcasters because they're always playing at a higher level of burden than somebody who chose to play a martial character.
Right. And this is one of those things too where Drider's meant for higher level, but I watched Clint and either Shane or Simon, run up a set of stairs, jump off a building, wild attack at something in midair, and have a chance of landing really good hits. It's the swing of this. And now that you guys are also seeing this, right? If people saw Unstoppable in the core book, right? That is the ability we added that makes it so that if you have that key bad guy that you don't want one-shotted because your party's built up for it and you don't want to have a Fable 2 incident. You want to go in and make sure you can take a hit or something, right? These big creatures don't have it. I think we have 2 creatures in the Bestiary that innately have it. But it's there if you want to run this Drider, as like queen of the Driders in your local dungeon or something and give her unstoppable so that when your fighter lands that big hit, and you give that, evil smile when she doesn't bother to soak those 3 wounds and only takes 1, you can have that experience. Or, you don't need to add it, right? It's not there to begin with. So if you want them to have the option to run in, swing, and drop it and just be like, that was easy. You also have that because they're both great experiences. And the whole point is to be able to play how you want to play, right?
Yeah, remember these are archetypes. They're not definitive. So, do folks have any additional questions? I think we've kind of hit all of the major things that we wanted to talk about. What the design of a creature looks like. We've talked about the 1.3 changes. It's kind of risky territory to go and talk too much about book 2 and 3. Yeah, it was 2 and 3 that we did. Well, I guess now you've had all the books.
Yeah.
But it's kind of risky to go in and talk too much about those. I think one piece of advice for the folks at home is if you're a player and you're about to go into the Karzog fight, get ready.
I will
Don't
share.
mess around.
I will share a funny story from book 2 that we actually got some feedback due to. So one of the goals in doing the Rise of the Rune Lords is to, because there's not nearly as many skill checks going on, is to make sure that the path is still able to be followed if a skill check has failed. And I've caught a few of them, in play testing, people have caught them and been like, oh, well, if I miss this roll, I can't continue. I was running a certain section in book 2 in which, I'll admit, I'm a little lazy. I take the maps that are in the book and paste it. And when I revealed the map, I didn't realize that the map had secret cache on it. And so it was either Shane or Simon who turned around and went, I go and open the secret cache that's on that.
It was Simon.
I'm like, oh, right. And just in my mind, right, I was like, okay. And we kept moving on with the plot. And so, somebody posted feedback and it was like, hey, this is a point where you get lost. And I'm like, I thought I fixed those. Oh no, that's what happened here. So, we're not infallible. And I also wanted to bring this up because on top of me just thinking it's a funny story, I do want to thank all the backers who are leaving feedback. Because whether it's a typo or, something that we missed, or, even something where, we're still working on it. Shape change, for example, we're still talking about. We didn't land on a solid change that we were happy with before this release, and so it's not updated. But as we sit there and we give our arguments, we run into experiences, and then we see feedback from people, and we can be like, okay, so this is what we're arguing for, and somebody else sees the same problem. So it's it's more than just me and you, it's others. All these things help us look and evaluate what we're already doing. And some things, whether it's whether you like something or not, that won't necessarily change something drastically. But when you spot that break, we look at it and we go, okay, did we miss this? Did we forget to take something into account? Why didn't Don break this earlier? Because that's what he does. So thank you, everybody, for putting in all the hard work and giving great feedback.
And I will call out one person on the forums specifically, Were Animal, because they go and they check things that I'm gonna notice that this creature is missing persuasion at D4 because it probably should have persuasion at D4, and just little things like that. And so big thanks to actually, I don't think I always read it as Were Animal. I think it's Werenimal because it's where and then the nimble part of animal. It was funny though. I had the experience of I had gotten through like 5 or 6 pages of feedback, and then their feedback was the very last one. I was like, oh, I've spent 5 hours working on this today. I'm almost done. Click open there, because you never know when you're in the forum feedback and you click. You never know, is this going to be like a single sentence or is this going to be a novel? And I clicked it open and was like, there's 60 bullets here today and it's 4:40. I'm not touching this today. I'll get to this tomorrow.
Yeah.
But big thanks, because they're catching a lot of things. And again, thanks to everybody else. We call out all those specific names. But again, you got to have 80 plus bullet points if you want to get called out on Design Corner. I'll just say that instead of trying to be like, we appreciate everybody. No, if you want call outs on Design Corner, you have to make my life painful and have 80 plus bullet point lists of actual legitimate feedback, and not, you can't just put 80 bullet points on the page and then say, where's my call out?
Or just start calling out the Design Corner, right? At more, minute 22, you misspoke, and it's like, yeah, I'll get you a call out. But seriously, again, the community has been fantastic, and you know, I am excited to go forward and play games with everybody, and the Savage Cruise, you know, run some Pathfinder for people. Working on terrain for that already. So I just the passion for everybody has been really exciting, and I hope everybody continues to get a kick out of things as we release them.
Well, on that note, now all you GMs watching, you have no more excuses. All the things that you need to run Savage Pathfinder for your groups that have been chomping at the bit are out, even if they are still, you know, basically in beta. So you know, if you really want to wait for everything to be final release, then just beat your groups with the it's in beta stick to keep them sated. Otherwise, it sounds like you have to start prepping.
Also,
But
keep
until
posting
next
on
time.
Facebook. I know there's at least one person who's been posting their Curse of the Crimson Throne, and those are always great to see. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So until next time, we'll see you folks later.
Bye, everybody.